Psychic Politics, an Aspect Psychology book by Jane Roberts, published in 1976, read by Martin John. Part 1, The Library and an Introduction to the Super Real. Chapter 1, The Library. We've just moved into a house, and now our Water Street quarters are vacant. As I write, I no longer hear the bridge traffic at the corner intersection or watch the pigeons on our roof above the parking lot. It was in that large living room that the Seth sessions first began. In the beginning, there was just Rob and me, artist and writer, husband and wife, experimenting as millions do with a Ouija board. By the time we left those apartments, nearly 40 students were crowding the living room each Tuesday. Seth, my trance personality, has dictated 2 books and was nearly finished with another one, and I'd written 3 of my own. More than that, when I walked into that apartment house for the first time, I was 31, and when I left for the final time, I was 45. The Seth sessions began when I was 35. In the beginning years, we were very secretive about the sessions, telling only a few close friends, but not the neighbors. A couple of times, Seth's booming voice carried through the night air. Once a neighbor came to investigate. It was summer, the windows were open, and he must have been struck by the odd quality of Seth's voice, deep, masculine-like, and accented in a strange fashion we've never been able to categorize. Anyway, when the knock came at the door, Rob turned on the television, loud, and our neighbor saw just the 2 of us, innocently sitting there. The man tried to explain about the voice he'd heard. Rob said, "It must have been the television program," and our neighbor went away, shaking his head. In a way, Seth is like a television program, in that I'm tuned into another channel of reality during sessions so that Seth's program plays over my own, or temporarily supersedes my own official station of consciousness. Sometimes I think that Seth is like some public education channel. Invisible dials whirl in my head, and he clicks on. Other times I think of Seth as a director of some multidimensional communications network, with me lucky enough to possess a unique set to pick up his stations. Certainly he seems to direct many of my other excursions into realms of consciousness beyond the norm. More and more stations seem available to me all the time, yet always Seth is the general communicator, the master of ceremonies, the newscaster, the genial guide through jungles and deserts and mountains of the inner mind. In other words, one way or another, I get signals from strange lands. I always have, though when I was growing up, I just labeled everything as inspiration and let it go at that. Finally, inspiration had a voice of its own and a personage, Seth, to boot. So Seth writes his books and I write mine, and each succeeding stable alteration of consciousness brings new messages from these alien yet somehow familiar inner lands of reality. Listening to these messages, translating them, writing them down, is life to me. Seth says that being is its own justification, and for a while I thought that perhaps I wrote to justify my life. It took some time for me to realize that being is writing to me. When I'm not turned on in my own particular fashion, my being seems dimmer. I become glum. So when I've finished one book, I can't wait to begin another. When I completed Adventures in Consciousness, then, my last book, I went around in a huff for a while. Nothing contented me, although Seth was dictating the, quote, unknown, end quote, reality in our twice-weekly sessions. The days disappeared into weeks, and I grew more restless. I felt disconnected from my being. So I began the series of steps I usually take whenever I want to contact deeper levels of my own consciousness. I did some watercolor painting, but that didn't seem to work. Then one afternoon early in October, I wrote the following poem, half angrily, depicting my situation. The poem is Invitation. Ah, love this stubborn mortal self, once more trying to contact its soul, and wondering on an autumn afternoon how best to trick it from its high domain. The mortal self says, "Dear soul, the earth is beautiful this time of year, and certainly some part of you is touched by the leaves dizzily falling everywhere, and by the misty autumn dusk that swirls around the neighborhood like a ghost on a treasure hunt. But if you aren't, isn't it enough that I'd like to talk? You're my soul, after all, so I don't see why I need an appointment to get a moment of your time. I'll meet you any place at all, though some structure seems to help. So I'm offering this poem, which is flexible enough to bear the weight of even the heaviest dialogue. First of all, I'd like to know if you've heard a thing I've had to say so far. So before I really begin, would you kindly give me some sign that you are listening? With this, the mortal self gets up, makes some coffee, then comes back and sits down again to wait. It wonders who knows about the soul's world, except the self who surely doesn't know enough. And if the soul did speak, who'd know except its earthly counterpart? Suspense. The moments pass. The cat meows. The mortal self says, I feel like such an ass. Either I'm using the wrong approach, or my soul doesn't act as if it knows that I'm alive. End poem. There were actually many other verses to the poem, but these contained the main request. I wanted to feel in touch again, and I wanted an uprush of inspiration and energy. The mortal self, me, of course, went on rather quarrelsomely to say that it was only too ready to do whatever it was supposed to do next, providing the soul would be kind enough to explain it of its next project. Having written the poem, I rested my case and waited, though not too graciously. But what energy that poem set into action, and how it propelled me into new excursions. Because of it, this book is being written and my exterior life changed, so that now the Water Street apartments where all this began are now a memory. More than that, I became familiar with new dimensions of being and began to learn more about the alternate realities that wind in and out of this one all the time. Actually, I worked on the poem off and on for nearly a week, adding new verses as I thought of new arguments in my own favor. But still I received no answer as far as I could tell. No new insights, dreams, or ideas came to me. Great, I thought ironically, and I'd do another verse asking the soul where it was and what was wrong, and repeating my request for a kind of communication that I could understand. Each morning I'd sit at least briefly at my desk, waiting. About a week and a half later, on October 25, 1974, I plunked myself down as usual. By then I'd nearly forgotten the poem itself. There wasn't an idea in my head. Then, suddenly, my next project was presented to me so clearly that I could have no doubts. All at once, the image of a library was transposed over the southwest corner of the living room, and in it I saw my own image. At the same time, 2 paragraphs sprang to life within my mind. Excited, I wrote them down and then described the experience itself as it began to unfold. By then, I knew that the notes were themselves the beginning of a new book. These are my original notes. The first 2 paragraphs are arranged exactly as I saw them in my mental vision. I imagined that this was to set them off and let me know that new material was involved. Even later, that precise arrangement was significant to me. No man is an island unto himself, but each person contains an inner civilization of the self which he learns to govern with a psychic politics that is the framework for the outer world of government and law. The ego rises from the civilization of the psyche just as the ruler, king, queen, president, or dictator rises from the masses of the people, appointed, chosen, or taking control according to an inner politics first existing within the greater inner mind. The above 2 paragraphs affect me most strangely with a force difficult to describe. I feel that they exist somewhere else, and I have for centuries, that they are invisible, and that the book in which they appear has already been written, though I am just beginning to transcribe it. The book is a classic, known as such somewhere or in some other time. The 2 paragraphs above are just the beginning, yet they come to me with an impeccable sense of their rightness. Suddenly I'm sure that I'm meant to write that book, that it represents my path, and it is a part of my destiny. I don't mean that I feel forced to do this, but that I recognize in some odd manner the utter rightness of this path, this book, and what it represents to me. The book is to be called Psychic Politics. Certainly, I've been writing these years, and no one else, I'm convinced, could produce the Seth material or maintain the kind of relationship that I have with Seth. But this new book strikes me in an even more intimate fashion. Yet a sense of distance operates, the distance that still separates me from the complete manuscript in our time. For I am pulling it to me, or it is pulling me to it, one or the other, in the most natural fashion. There seems to be a path between me and the book, that strikes me more than anything else in my life so far as my way, so that I find myself wondering if I've already written it in some other place or time. It might have been written by someone else. But in any case, I feel that I'm the one meant to transcribe it, and that this act brings the book alive in three-dimensional reality, even though it exists outside of that context and is being translated into it. Part of the book, the main part, represents certain principles and dynamics of the psyche that have always been known at certain levels. Yet what I add in terms of fresh examples and experience will make the book applicable in our time. Again, I feel strongly that this is a classic, perhaps lost from libraries that were destroyed in other civilizations. I recognize this sense of perfect rightness only now as something I've been searching for years. That would bring its own high assurance and psychic aptness, as if I've been casting my consciousness out in all directions, probing, and that sooner or later I'd have to find this clear circle or path to a particular source. And somehow I kept myself off balance in the meantime, and that I continued searching when it seemed that I should be satisfied, because I wouldn't know what it was I wanted until I found it. It, the book, may only be one of many, but I seem to sense it as if it is the first of many in a great library, bound in gold, a collection of classics that are somehow echoed in other ways within the private and mass psyche. The image of the library may be symbolic, of course, yet on another level I can see myself standing there by those volumes, nearly weeping, thinking that I've finally come home. I feel that my destiny is to transcribe these invisible books, sifting them through my psyche as it lives in our time, and therefore recreating the books by imbuing them once more with life. They have to be translated through the flesh, and they grow through its medium, even while the transcriber has to have the most perfect affinity for them on other psychic levels. This was the next step waiting for me that I was to follow, and perhaps all the others have been leading to this one. I don't know where Seth fits into all of this. Through me, he's been writing his books for years. But I don't feel any conflict between this new work of mine and his. Instead, they are connected. Seth's books represent one unique personality addressing other unique personalities. These other new books seem to be something else entirely, apart, aloof, finished in one sense, principles that will come alive through my private experience. And I feel that the books and my life will interweave, so that each adds to the other. Just as I finished writing the above, there was a knock at the door. I thought it was the paper boy and yelled, "Come in!" Instead, to my complete surprise, a young man came striding into the living room, his arms confidently swinging, his eyes shining, moist, and determined. I'll call him Lyman. Throughout this book, names and personal details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. I nearly groaned in disbelief. I'd met him only the night before when he'd attended my expansion of consciousness class. He identified himself by phone earlier that day as a budding parapsychologist, speaking with great erudite phrases. After class, though, he wanted me to tell him what to do with his life, as if it was my challenge instead of his. I took nearly an hour to talk to him, hopefully to reinforce his confidence in himself. Apparently I'd succeeded, but not in the way I thought, because here he was, unannounced. With one brisk gesture he had his jacket off, his tape recorder on the table beside me, next to the pile of Kleenex, soggy, sitting there. I had a cold, and he attacked me with his energetic eyes. With no preamble, he started in. He'd phoned another psychic, enthusiastically telling me how he'd tracked the woman down to her hospital bed. Then, though the call cost me $20, it was worth it, he said. I told her all about you and your class and found that she'd read your books, and I asked her to comment on your ideas. I just sat looking at him and at the Kleenex. You say there isn't going to be a Holocaust, he said, and all the other psychics, including Case, say there will be. She said that the Holocaust won't come in the year 2000, but any day now. What have you got to say about that? He turned on his recorder. Not a damn thing, I said. He plunged on. And she says there is a hierarchy in the astral plane, and that only 7 people have access to the Akashic records, and she's one of them. The others charge huge prices and only tell about one life, where for far less, only $50, she gives a reading that includes all lives you've had in other times that affect this one. But you say there aren't any Akashic records to begin with, that they're only a symbol for something else. So how do you explain that? His appreciation of his own astute abilities as a psychic detective was almost too much for him to bear. I let him go on for another 15 minutes before I asked quietly enough, "What did you come here for?" He was eloquent. He gestured grandly. I wanted to ask Seth to comment on the discrepancies between what he says and what others say. I wanted you to ask. I couldn't care less, I said, and with a very quiet but studied ungraciousness. What? He asked. I stared at him and blew my nose, dirtying another Kleenex. But Seth may care, he said, scandalized. I doubt that he does, I said. There was silence for the first time since Lemon barged in on me. I said, quietly enough, "You could have apologized for just coming here without calling first." He didn't even blush. "I thought you wouldn't see me, that you'd be busy," he said, obviously impressed with his own daring. "So I just came anyway." "I just started a new book as you came in," I said, "and I still have supper dishes to do, and a Seth session in an hour." "Can I bum one of these?" he asked, picking up my pack of cigarettes. The phone rang. I answered it. A young man asked to attend one of my classes. But what he really wanted was help in making a decision. "It's a spiritual, mental decision," he said 3 or 4 times in 3 or 4 different mixed-up ways. He wanted me to tell him what to do. I took a few minutes to talk to him, saying that getting other people to make your decisions for you was no way to learn how to make decisions, and no training at all for any kind of development. I gave a few simple techniques for clearing his mind and hung up. Mr. Junior Parapsychologist was still sitting there. "You're still here because I'm trying to figure out my reasons for your visit, as apart from yours," I said. I meant, but didn't say, how come this guy came to bug me just when I felt that I'd just found my own true path. As much as I disliked the pat phrase, it seemed completely apt. "You mean there's another reason?" Lehman was instantly excited. "Like I've known you or Seth in a past life or something?" "I knew it. I have to admit that I knew it. Another psychic told me so." "I'm afraid that's not what I mean at all," I said. But he was all wound up again. Visions of grandeur and hope tensed his muscles. He leaned forward so abruptly that the piles of Kleenex quivered. Startled, I looked up, and suddenly I saw my reason for Lyman's visit. I realized that through the entire interview, from the instant he walked through the door, Lehman had been bigger than life somehow, at least as far as I was concerned. Super real. I'd been presented, or he'd presented me, with the first character from my book. He was so himself, so impeccably what he was, that I could only marvel at his uniqueness, whether he bugged me or not. It was as if he arrived freshly out of space and time, self-delivering himself as a package of which he was, of course, supremely proud, but a package that I'd been bound to look at with my own eyes. And he was a fantastic package tied with glowing bands of enthusiasm. I just didn't like the contents. And I saw why. He was a living presentation of some of my old fears and ideas, coming just when I thought I'd just given them up. I'd always scorned the idea of Akashic records as a psychic convention, representing something else perhaps. Certainly I didn't believe that some super score sheet of our lives was written out there in space somewhere for anybody to read. On the other hand, before Lehman's visit, I found myself in a library at another level of reality, and felt it my destiny to transcribe and recreate some of the books there. I'd been doing all this thinking, staring at the freshly minted Lyman, when I realized that he was waiting for me to speak, leaning forward with his great intent, anticipatory stare. "Seth and I are related, then," he shouted, unable to bear it for another moment. I had to retain some skepticism, but I've known it all along. He reached for another of my cigarettes, nervously, as if sure that the revelations of the ages were about to fall upon his shoulders, and he wanted to be prepared. "No, you and Seth aren't related," I said gently as I could. But I thought, of course, Lyman was representing my own ideas about something else too. The overly gullible people who parade as skeptics. All many of them need is a world that they've been some big shot in a past life, or known some famous person, and presto, they're confirmed believers. People like that, like the boy on the phone, never trust their own vision. And up to now, I hadn't completely trusted mine either, I thought. Every time I was presented with a Lyman or the Akashic records or spiritual name-dropping, I'd think, those people trust their visions and look at them. Some kind of integrity is missing from their lives. so I watched my own visions with a stern, questioning eye. But I'd been wrong. Those people relied on dogma, not visions at all. I had to get rid of Lyman so I could figure it all out. He looked disappointed, but still determined to stay forever. You could almost hear him crowing later to his friends. "I just hung in there, boy," to me he said. "You have to understand, I have to track the famous psychics down and compare what they say, and note the discrepancies." His voice rang with conviction. It was an invigorating, exciting sport to him, but he wasn't going to run around my track anymore. "Great," I said. "You do what you have to do. Enjoy yourself, if that's your thing. But it isn't my thing, okay?" I was grinning. "I still have a session tonight." This time my voice was firm. He stood up. "You don't understand," he asked. "You bet I do," I said. "Do your thing, Lyman. Just not here, if you don't mind." But I was laughing because I realized that in the past I'd often doubted my own vision just because I didn't trust other people's visions. I'd begun to feel that visions themselves were at best untrustworthy, and that the more you believed in your own, the blinder you become to the reality of others. Now, in fact, I saw that there was no need to judge visions at all. They simply are. You accept or reject them. But thank God, I no longer felt that I must be responsible for the reliability of all visions, or for how others use or misuse them. I'm only responsible for my own. And what about my own? I wondered when Lyman finally left. What about the library that I'd sensed so briefly before the interruption? What about the book? Was I, as I suspected, at the beginning of a new creative and psychic adventure, or would I back off? I could see myself saying, "I've got this, library in the sky." And me answering, "Sure you have, baby. Don't worry. It's all right." Then I thought, symbolic or not, real in our terms or unreal, a part of my psyche or separate, there's something there, and I'm going to find out what it is. When Lyman left, it was already past 8 p.m. Seth was dictating his own book, The Unknown Reality, in our twice-weekly private sessions. One was due in about an hour. Years ago, we'd mutually settled upon 9 p.m. Monday and Wednesday. This was particularly advantageous in the beginning. People weren't as apt to drop in during the middle of the week, but besides this, I'm a night person. I can't imagine holding sessions regularly in the morning or afternoon, for example. My mind wasn't really on having a session that night, though. I was thinking about the day's experiences for one thing, and still had the supper dishes to do. Rob and I divided our household chores. I get meals, except breakfast, and do dishes, plus some of the cleaning. He does the wash and the rest of the cleaning. Anyway, that day I'd stacked the lunch dishes too. So I went out to the kitchen, finished my chores, and finally sat down with Rob for our session. My own experiences vary at such times. Usually, when Seth is dictating a book, I simply alter my own consciousness and let Seth go at it. He takes my glasses off, begins to dictate after a few remarks to Rob, and continues, with a few rest periods, for the next 2 or 3 hours. That night things began to happen the minute I sat down for the session. Luckily, Seth described one of my experiences, and I was able to tell Rob about others on the spot. because later I didn't remember what happened at all. This was our 714th official session, Wednesday, October 23rd, 1974. I can imagine how Rob looked, sitting there grinning because I had a cold. I'd been excited over the library, and after Lemon left, I wondered aloud about having a session at all. But here Seth was, coming through almost as soon as we sat down. Almost at the same time, I sensed an odd pyramid effect over my head, a subjective phenomenon that I experience now and then with psychic work. Another fairly familiar sensation accompanied the pyramid effect. I felt physically massive. I'd no sooner told Rob about this when Seth came through. This is somewhat of a monumentous evening for Rupert, as Seth calls me. As I speak, he is experiencing certain sensations in which his body feels drastically elongated, the head reaching out beyond the stars, the whole form straddling realities. Now, in a sense, the physical body does this always. That is, it sits astride realities, containing even within itself dimensions of time and being that cannot be verbally described. The unknown reality and the psyche's greater existence cannot be separated from the intimate knowledge of the flesh, however, for the life of the flesh takes place within that framework. As earlier mentioned, generally the conscious self focuses in but one small dimension. That dimension, however, is experienced as fully as possible, its clear brilliance and exquisite focus possible only because you tune into it and bring to it the foremost of your attention. When you understand how to do this, then you can begin to tune in to other stations as well. As he continued, Seth used my experiences to point up the existence of the unknown reality and to discuss other ways of exploring it. There are inner conventions, then, as there are outer ones, he said. As the outer mores try to force you to conform to generally accepted ideas, so the inner conventions try to force you to make your inner experience conform to preconceived packaging. There are good reasons for conventions. Generally, they help organize experience. If they are lightly held to and accepted, they can serve well as guidelines. Applied with a heavy hand, they become unnecessary dogma, rigidly limiting experience. Rupert has thus far insisted upon his private vision and his unique expression of the unknown reality as he experiences it. So he brings back bulletins that do not agree with conventional psychic line. End quote from Seth. Seth spoke for nearly an hour about psychic-guided tours and the various kinds of dogmas that can program inner experience. Then we took a rest period. The feeling of massiveness Seth described was still with me. I felt as if my head would go through the roof when I stood up. At the same time, I knew quite well that I retained my usual physical size, even though I was experiencing it differently at one level. So when I did stand up, one part of me walked around in my usual fashion, while another part of me felt as if my head reached far above the earth. Actually, our break only lasted about 10 minutes. Then Seth returned and continued dictating his own book. He spoke for half an hour and then said, "Give us a moment." Instantly, I went into a series of experiences that I forgot almost at once. I tried to describe them to Rob on the spot, and here I'll have to give excerpts from Rob's notes taken at the time. Even now, as far as I'm concerned on a conscious level, the experiences might as well have happened to someone else. Only this sense of knowing and certainty remains. The events themselves vanish almost as soon as they happened. Rob's notes. If I can get this, it'll be something, I'll tell you, Jane said, lighting up a cigarette. She sipped a beer. Bob, what I'm getting is quick, beautiful sounds that I can't duplicate. Very quick, very musical, connected with the spin of electrons and cellular composition. The spin of electrons is faster than the cellular composition. The faster speed of the electrons somehow gives the cells their boundaries. And there's something that's in a trance, say, in crystals, that's alive in cells. Wait a minute. What I'm getting is fantastic sound that's imprisoned in a crystal, that speaks through light, that's the essence of personality. I'm getting almost jewel-like colored sounds. Wait, I'll see what I can get with it. I want to get it in verbal stuff, and I'm getting it so fast. As the seed falls, blown by the wind in any environment, so there's a seed of personality that rides on the wings of itself and falls into worlds of many times and places, falling with a sound that is its own true tone, struck in different chords. These sounds are aware of their own separateness, gloriously unique, yet each one merging into a symphony. Each sound recognizes itself as itself, striking the dimensional medium in which it finds its expression. Yet it's aware of the infinite, multitudinous sounds it makes in other realities, the instruments through which it so grandly plays. Each cell strikes in the same fashion, and so does each self, in a kaleidoscope in which each slightest variation has meaning and affects the individual notes made by all. So we strike in more realities than one, and now I hear those notes together yet separately, perhaps as raindrops, and attempt to put them together, and yet hear each separate note. And suddenly I heard my own true tone, which I'm bound to follow. After the first part, my delivery had been so steady that Rob wondered if I'd gone back into a Seth trance, minus Seth's usual voice effects and manner. I'd spoken so quickly that Rob had trouble taking notes. Yet all I could say when I was done was, "It's like a note finds its own true tone, but once you strike it, you know that's it. You've got it made. You know your own meaning in the universe, even if you can't verbalize it." When it was over, I felt entirely different, even though whatever happened had vanished from my conscious mind. I knew, even though I no longer remembered what I had knew. All in all, Seth actually said little about the library itself, but I immediately connected the true tone with my feelings when I first glimpsed the library, and with my certainty that I'd come home when I saw the books there. I said to Rob, "It's strange. I feel that no matter which way I turn, there's a path laid out for me, and I never felt that way before." Seth didn't come through any more that evening. I've only quoted the portions of the session that directly related to my own experiences. The rest of the session appears in context in Seth's own book. The library, though, began to assume a reality of its own. The next day, as I sat at my desk, I suddenly knew that it was only part of a much larger establishment. Then I found myself there, facing a floor-to-ceiling bookcase. It didn't occur to me to turn around to see what was behind me. To my left, though, I glimpsed a library table of light-colored wood. Far to my right was a window with a southern exposure, and outside were lush green grounds, though it was autumn, and the trees were bare in the world that I knew. Several times that day I suddenly found myself standing in the library, always in the same place. Later toward evening, I put sausage and spaghetti on the stove to cook for dinner and sat down to work at my desk for a few moments before calling Rob for our evening meal. I was looking out our wide bay windows at the street below. With no preamble, I was aware of the library once again, and saw myself drinking a golden-colored elixir of some kind. I knew that the drink, taken there, was something like an overall tonic, toning up the entire physical body, and specifically purifying the blood. I got the impression that this elixir was given to anyone from here who went there, and that it also provided the necessary energy needed for work at hand. As I drank the liquid in the library, at my table here I thought that it looked like honey, only not as thick, and my head here suddenly felt very relaxed and loose. I just remembered something else. While doing the supper dishes later, I had the feeling that you could look out the library to our world, and at my particular corner of Walnut and Water Streets, and it seemed that our world was a part of the library grounds. I also knew, or thought I knew, that some kind of system of study was being set up for me. I wasn't to spend all of my time in the library, but would also be outside, in the field, so to speak. My feeling, even then, was that of some other level of reality. I'd entered a college or a community of scholars, perhaps for a course of study. In the past, I've had no great love of libraries, except that they provide a needed service. That is, I used to think of them as places that had silence, please signs, but my library didn't strike me that way at all. More than that, I kept thinking, I've come home whenever I found myself there. It's quite possible, of course, that someone else might see flashes of lights instead of books, or experience that same environment in a different fashion. But for me, from the beginning, there was a library at another level of experience, and I knew I'd be transcribing books from it and recreating them, and that while I went about my work here, I'd be making my way there at the same time. End chapter. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.